Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to the Black Death. Today, I'm actually going to have a lecture for you, so you're welcome. No, I'm just kidding. I hope this will be an interesting lecture. It's actually my first one ever, so hopefully it goes well. I'm probably going to have to do a few takes of this, and it's going to be irritating, but I'll try my darndest. So, to begin, I just want everybody to think about this in the back of your mind, that disease is omnipresent in human history. It's always present. It's always there. We've dealt with it, since time can remember. And a lot of the diseases actually came from animals and cross interaction between humans and animals. So that's disturbing. So different ways we can learn about, the plague and especially the Black Death is through archaeological evidence, historical records, such as written primary sources, which that's what we're reading, every week. We're looking at primary sources because that's key to history. And mytho-historical accounts, such as the Torah, the Bible, the Quran. And one of the examples given that some people may know of are the plagues of Egypt. So not all of it is a plague necessarily, but we definitely do see that coming up in the Bible and elsewhere. So this is an image by Peter Bruegel the Elder, a Dutch and Flemish artist from the 1500s, and this is called The Triumph of Death, circa 1562. So as you can see, I'm looking closer myself, it is taking everyone down. That's the thing about disease usually is it's, indiscriminate. It can take anybody down, nobles, kings, peasants, you name it. So just keep that in the back of your mind as well, especially in the Middle Ages. They weren't safe. They didn't have the type of money to, they didn't have the means to necessarily prevent them from getting something. So it's an equalizer. So the term the Black Death comes from the 19th century epidemiologist. It was coined in 1823 by an English author. And so it wasn't a term used in the Middle Ages. It is a more recent term. And so medieval authors actually called it the Great Mortality, the Plague, or the Great Malady. So keep that in mind as well. There are 3 cycles of pandemic in Europe that they have really focused on. So that is the Plague of Justinian, which was an 8th century plague. It was in the Eastern Roman Empire, and it actually brought the fall of the Justinian Empire and Justinian. So then we have the Black Death in the 14th century, which was a medieval disease that entered Europe through the ports of Italy and spread rapidly. And then we have the Great Dying of the 17th century. So this is just a little example of the deadliest pandemics in history. As you can see, if we look a little bit closer, the worldwide smallpox epidemic killed a ton of people, pretty much the most. And then we have the Spanish flu, the Plague of Justinian, and it goes further down. You have to take these types of, you have to take this with a grain of salt because, they didn't have head counts in the Middle Ages. They weren't out there going and counting how many people died. So that's something that's a little bit more recent. So the Middle Ages, we have to, like I said, take it with a grain of salt. So I want you to look over this a little bit more. I'll wait a little bit, or actually you can pause it. So we'll go on to the next slide. So the anatomy of the Black Death. There are some key symptoms of the Black Death that are pretty gross. So you have buboes, which are boil-like inflammations near the lymphatic nodes. And it's pretty gross. You can actually Google it. I'm not going to show it because it can be disturbing and I don't want to offend anybody. But Google it and you can get more of an idea of what this looks like. There are also black lesions on the skin. It turns black, especially in the hands and extremities. And then there's a bloody cough, with your lungs filling up with blood, pretty gross. And then you have intestinal distension and discharge. Next, there are types of bubonic plague. There's the bubonic hemorrhagic, which is an infection of the lymph nodes and carried in your blood. Septicemic is pretty intense. That one's, really intense. It's got the infection of the blood system, and it is guaranteed death and extremely dangerous. And then there's pneumatic, where it infects the lungs. So it is called Yersinia pestis, and it actually comes from the guy who was learning about it, Yersin, So we're not going to necessarily talk about that too much. But it attacks the blood cells aggressively. It is still around today. There are multiple strains and variations, much like COVID. The fleas carry the bacterium, so it's attacking the blood on the flea. So what a flea does is it bites and it injects blood and it takes blood. So it is spreading that disease around when it bites you or the animals that it bites. Fleas can also die from this bacterium. Animals can carry the fleas, especially mice. Mice are, in and out of homes and places where people are, so we're in contact with them a lot. It doesn't affect humans like it does animals, though. Animals can carry the disease and not necessarily be infected in the same way humans are. It's not necessarily fatal. So there are traditional and revisionist approaches to the Black Death, which is key because we're in a history class, right? So we want to know the historiography. So what historiography is pretty much the history of history. What have other scholars said about history? What have they argued? What have they, posited theory-wise? So the traditional focus is on one disease, the bubonic plague. It is centered in Europe, where the sources mostly are. That's where a lot of the writing is. That's where a lot of the texts are. That's where we get it. That's why history is so Eurocentric, is a lot of the texts come from there. And there's 3 periods, the ones mentioned previously: Justinian, the the Black Plague, and the Great? Anyhow, and they're all grounded in historical records. And since like I said, we mostly look at text. So there's the revisionist, which is focused on science of the disease, strains and variations of plague. It's interested in global interactions, not just Europe. What's going on in the wider spread of the world, And then it's a wider, expansive periodization. It's not just the Middle Ages or when this plague was most predominant. It goes from ancient to modern times, many periods of the pandemic diseases. It's also interdisciplinary. It's not just history. It's also got science, archaeology, different types of disciplines coming together to study this plague. And then, so one of the examples I'm having you read, her name is Monica Green, and she's in the revisionist camp. Historians, according to her, need to be scientists as well. The Black Death is central to our understanding, as I said, of the past and the present. That's what Monica Green is saying. It serves as a mirror on our own society. So always keep this in mind. It's important to always remember how the past is tied to the present and vice versa. So there are pre-modern beliefs about the plague. Religious. So Christian, it was believed to be a plague on humanity, a curse from God. The original sin when Adam and Eve sinned, along with our own personal sins. It's a punishment for our sins. Islam is a little bit different. It doesn't necessarily do the whole sin thing, but it's the plague and will of God. It is the will of God. God has chosen this to happen. And they believe that you can manage the plague with communal piety, prayer. And like I said, they believe the plague was an extension of the will of Allah. Then there's Zoroastrianism, which is the ancient religion of Persia before Christianity and Islam popped up. And they believe in everyday and supernatural malevolence, especially the jinn, which are powerful genies who could take on malevolent forms. They believe that plague can come through supernatural forces. So we see there's kind of this supernatural idea of a higher power or different types of things that come into play that are the reason for this plague. So for example, Henry of Lancaster in the Book of Holy Medicine, I could have helped myself and cut off the festering limb by true confession and repentance of the heart. I should have chastened my flesh and cut away not only the fire of sin, but the heat of the flesh by abstinence and other hardships, so that the fire's passage would have been cut off, so that it had gone no further. So we get a religious idea here of how they felt around this time. It was a religious thing. Modern beliefs. It's a little bit different today. We have historical and scientific beliefs that start around the 19th century with the emergence of germ theory, 1870s to 1880s. Most today believe that the Black Death was the bubonic plague primarily caused this death. Dominant historical and scientific perspectives on the plague. There is one perspective that it's the bubonic plague only. That is it. The Black Death is no more. It comes from the 19th century germ theory. Proponents are Louis Pasteur, which some of you may know, Robert Koch, and Alexander Yersin, which I mentioned earlier, where we get Yersinia pestis from, and Shibasaburo Kitasato. Sorry if I butchered that. So all of them are scientific researchers that say microscopic organisms on vectors of disease, like fleas on rats. So like I said earlier, rats are sylvatic vectors of disease. They move between the wild spaces and domestic spaces. They're in contact with us. Think of New York. If you've been to New York, you're going to see rats in the subway. I have. So that's something you may deal with there. And I've gotten a mouse in the house before, and that poor thing, I was like, you need to get out. So we have that going on. And then you have a recent development, which is the genetic exploration of Yersinia pestis, which I don't know as much about that because I'm a historian, I'm not a scientist. So if anybody wants to comment on the scientific aspect of this, please do that in the discussion boards. Please add to this. I'm looking for as many people's perspectives and knowledge on this as much as possible. Monica Green, you guys are reading her. You should be getting familiar with her work. She is the leading proponent of the bubonic plague only. Her perspective is rooted in modern genetics and science. She argues that historians need to work with the geneticists and that we can take modern science to understand the past. This can allow us to look at the prominence of plague in places without sources, which is important. Like I said, historians are key on sources, but we're starting to branch out. We include art, science, etc. So not the bubonic plague. Other people are skeptical of using modern ideas of the plague and inscribing them on the past. So taking modern notions of epidemiology and applying them to the past, voices of the past. That can be problematic for some. They rely on historical records in context of history. Some of the symptoms supposedly do not line up with the sources. Therefore, other diseases must have been in play. And then we have the bubonic plague plus. Multiple diseases match what we think about as bubonic plague, like cholera. It's a varied contagion. Why is the second pandemic worse than the third? Why does it move so fast in the 14th century? It moves from Asia to Europe to Africa pretty fast. Rats? They argue that it is impossible for so many rats to be moving across the Eurasian continent. Like, how can that happen, really? So, and then there's varied virulence. Why is it so lethal at times? Sometimes not. Sometimes it's pandemic, sometimes it's endemic. There's historian Samuel Cohn, who's a proponent of this theory, professor of medieval history. If you're more interested in I have an article by him, but I'm not going to make you read it. But if you want to know more, email me, I can give it to you. I know most people don't want to do more reading than they're assigned, but if you do, let me know. So this theory, or this, the bubonic plague plus, is received the least amount of attention in scholarship, but it's really a middle ground. So I kind of think this may be more along the lines of what happened, but I do not specialize in this. I don't know, so don't take my word for it. I just am here to teach you guys about it, not be an expert, but maybe I will become one, inshallah. So how to study the Black Death? There's modern scientific, which is ideas that are foreign to people who lived and experienced the diseases at the time, right? So it's our modern ideas. In the past, in the Middle Ages, they wouldn't have thought about it the way we did. Or there's culturally relative and historicists. We attempt to understand the experience of the people who experienced the disease on their time, on their time. Yeah, I can't think of the other word. Sometimes I forget words, so bear with me, guys. But we're going to emphasize the cultural understandings on their own terms. That's what I was looking for, on their own terms. So I hope I wasn't too fast with this. I actually did it all in one go. I'm pretty pumped. Where's my record button so I can stop recording here soon? But I'm pretty excited I did it. I think we did a good job. Let me know what you think. So cool. I will have more lectures for you. This is just kind of an introduction, some basic information. I'll probably go over some of the texts that we've read and build on them and hopefully give you some sort of perspective if you're having trouble. But if you need anything from me, please email me. I hope this helped give you some sort of an idea of the background to it. And I look forward to seeing you guys and working with you more. Bye.